We often look to the past to understand ourselves. Tonight, we turn our attention to the year 1879 and the solemn story of Julia Martha Thomas. It's a case that reminds us that behind historical records are real people whose lives were irrevocably changed by the events that transpired. This is their story, as best as it can be told. In the spring of that year, the London suburb of Richmond was a picture of respectable Victorian life. Its peaceful parks and elegant villas offered a tranquil retreat from the industrial heart of the city. Here, in a modest two-story home known as Vine Cottages, lived Mrs. Julia Martha Thomas, a widow in her late 50s. Twice married and twice widowed, Mrs. Thomas lived a reclusive and solitary life. She was known by her few acquaintances as a woman of some means, but also one of eccentric habits and a notably particular, often severe temperament. Like many women of her class, she relied on domestic help to manage her household. The relationship between mistress and servant in this era was often complex, a delicate balance of dependence and authority. And at Vine Cottages, this dynamic was about to take a terrifying and tragic turn. In late January of 1879, a new domestic servant was hired by Mrs. Thomas. Her name was Kate Webster. 30 years old, Webster was a stark contrast to her employer. Born in Ireland, her life had been one of hardship and crime. She had a long history of theft and deception, having been imprisoned multiple times across the country. She was known to use many aliases and often fabricated elaborate stories about her past, claiming to have been married with children to elicit sympathy or gain employment. By the time she arrived at Mrs. Thomas's doorstep, Kate Webster was a practiced survivor, hardened by a life on the margins of society. She took the position as a live-in cook and general servant not as a career, but as a means of temporary shelter and income, all while concealing the turbulent reality of her past from her new, unsuspecting employer. The arrangement at Vine Cottages was fraught with tension from the beginning. Mrs. Thomas was a demanding employer, highly critical of Webster's work and frequently finding fault with her cooking and cleaning. She was known to be short-tempered and exacting in her standards, which grated on the fiercely independent and resentful nature of her new servant. Kate Webster, for her part, found the work laborious and her employer difficult to please. Friends she visited on her days off later recalled her frequent complaints about Mrs. Thomas, whom she described as a miserly and irritable old woman. The quiet cottage, meant to be a place of domestic order, became a crucible of clashing personalities. For just over a month, a silent war of wills was waged within its walls, as the mistress's constant criticism met the servants' growing animosity. This undercurrent of mutual dislike would soon escalate with dreadful finality. Sunday, the 2nd of March, began like any other day at the cottage, but the simmering tensions were about to boil over. Mrs. Thomas attended the morning service at her local Presbyterian church, as was her custom. Upon her return, she confronted Kate Webster about the quality of her work, and a fierce argument erupted. The precise details of their final exchange are known only from Webster's later accounts, but it was the culmination of weeks of bitterness. Mrs. Thomas was angry, and Webster was defiant. The argument purportedly continued after Mrs. Thomas returned from the evening church service. It was during this final heated confrontation that Kate Webster's resentment spiraled into rage. According to Webster, Mrs. Thomas made a move as if to strike her. In that moment, a line was crossed. The precarious social order of mistress and servant was shattered by an explosion of violence. In a fit of fury, Kate Webster grabbed her employer by the throat and threw her to the floor. The fall caused Julia Thomas to strike her head, leaving her stunned and incapacitated. Webster later claimed that, in the heat of the moment, she seized a heavy wooden box and brought it down on Mrs. Thomas's head, ending her life. The quiet of the respectable Richmond villa was broken by an act of shocking brutality. The argument was over, and in the silence that followed, Kate Webster was no longer just a disgruntled servant. She was a murderer. The immediate problem of her difficult employer was gone, but a far more complex and gruesome challenge had taken its place. The body of Julia Martha Thomas now lay on the floor of her own home. What followed the murder was not an act of panic, but a display of chilling and methodical resolve. Over the course of the next day and night, Kate Webster undertook the horrific task of concealing her crime. She dismembered the body, a gruesome process that she carried out with a kitchen knife and a meat saw. She then boiled the remains in the laundry copper, rendering them down to make them easier to dispose of. Portions of the body were packed into a wooden box and a leather Gladstone bag. The head, however, she kept separate. Late one evening, she carried the box to Richmond Bridge and dropped it into the dark waters of the River Thames. She disposed of other remains in various locations around the area. It was a calculated and macabre effort to erase every physical trace of Julia Martha Thomas, a plan designed not only to hide the murder, but to allow Webster to take her victim's place. With the evidence of her crime hidden, Kate Webster began a bold and audacious deception. She started to impersonate her former employer. She wore Mrs. Thomas's clothes, slept in her bed, and began to deal with local tradesmen as if she were the mistress of the house. She told inquiring neighbors that Ms. Thomas had gone away to visit friends. Webster's deception reached its peak when she entered into negotiations with a local publican named John Church to sell the entire contents of 2 Vine Cottages. Meanwhile, on the 10th of March, a coalman discovered a wooden box washed up on the bank on the Thames at Barnes Bridge. Inside were the partial remains of a woman. The police were alerted, and a murder investigation was launched, though the identity of the victim remained a mystery. The net, however, was slowly beginning to close around the woman living a stolen life in Richmond. Kate Webster's charade could not last. Neighbors grew suspicious of the prolonged absence of Mrs. Thomas and the strange behavior of her servant, who was now lavishly wearing her mistress's silk dresses. The delivery men hired by John Church to remove the furniture from the cottage on the 18th of March were met by concerned neighbors who alerted the police. When an officer arrived, Webster answered the door, but her composure began to crack. She made an excuse and fled the house, catching a train before the alarm could be fully raised. Upon entering 2 Vine Cottages, investigators made a series of grim discoveries. They found bloodstains, charred human bones in the fireplace, and fatty deposits in the laundry copper. They also found a letter left behind that gave Webster's home address in Ireland. The evidence from the cottage, combined with the remains found in the Thames, allowed police to finally identify the victim as Julia Martha Thomas. The hunt for Kate Webster became a sensation. with newspapers across Britain and Ireland publishing descriptions of the fugitive. Having fled to her family's home in Killarney, Ireland, Webster was soon tracked down. On the 29th of March, she was arrested by the Royal Irish Constabulary and escorted back to London to stand trial for murder. The trial began at the Old Bailey in July 1879. The prosecution presented the overwhelming forensic evidence from the cottage and the testimony of neighbors and merchants who had dealt with Webster during her deception. Webster, in her defense, attempted to blame her former lover and John Church, concocting an elaborate story of their involvement. She maintained her innocence throughout the proceedings, but her shifting stories and the mountain of evidence against her were damning. The jury was not swayed by her performance. After deliberating for just over an hour, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. The judge, wearing the black cap, sentenced Kate Webster to death. In her final days, with all hope exhausted, she finally gave a full confession to a prison chaplain, admitting to the crime and exonerating the men she had falsely accused. She detailed the argument, the murder, and the subsequent gruesome cover-up. One mystery, however, remained. She claimed she had given the victim's head to a young boy she knew, who then threw it into the river, but its location was never revealed. On the 29th of July, 1879, Kate Webster was executed by hanging at Wandsworth Prison. The case, with its shocking brutality and calculated deception, left a profound mark on the Victorian public, a grim tale of class conflict and human darkness that unfolded behind the curtains of a quiet suburban home. Thank you for spending this time with us. Reflecting on these past events is a way of remembering the individuals involved and the impact their stories had on their communities. If you have any thoughts on today's case, we invite you to share them respectfully in the comments below. We hope you will join us again for our next true crime case.